We're looking at Richard Swinburne on his views on personal identity. We could say this is a video on philosophy of mind. It is personal identity over time, so we'll consider it a metaphysics video. Those two topics overlap, of course. But the question that we are going to investigate is, at least the real question according to Swinburne, is this: a person P2 at T2 is the same person as P1 at T1, an earlier time, if and only if what? How do you fill in the blank? So a person at one time that is later than another time, what do you identify as the criteria for the person being the same person at two different times? Now, there is a different question, and Swinburne says this question that we've just asked is often confused with a second question, a different question, and it's important to distinguish these two. So the different question is, what evidence do we have for saying that a person P2 at T2 is the same person as P1 at T1? It's different. There's a difference between the evidence that we have for the answer and the actual answer itself. So there is a significant distinction. So just to get a little feel for this, suppose, for example, there is a criminal who committed a crime and left absolutely no evidence linking her to the crime. Now, whether that's possible or not, we won't worry about it, but suppose that it was possible and that's what happened. There's no evidence. Not no evidence that was found, but no evidence was there to be found. Now, did she still commit the crime? Of course. That's our presupposition. She committed the crime, but there's no evidence that she committed the crime. These are two different things, and Swinburne says that it's really important to distinguish these things. Just a couple other examples. There are specific facts that are of great distance, either in space or time or both, and we would have no way of obtaining evidence for or against these, but there are facts. There is a truth of the matter. So just as an example, there's a planet with large mammalian animals right now eating something like corn. Now, of course, the right now is a problem itself, but it's either true or it's not if we assume some kind of objective view of the universe where we can have a right now. It's either true or it's not true. But we don't have any evidence for it, of course. Or maybe closer to home in some respects, Julius Caesar's mother wore a red robe exactly 1 week after her 5th birthday. Something that's either true or false. There's no way we're ever going to find out whether that's true or false, but it was either a fact or something that did not happen. So it's one thing to be the case. It's a different thing to have evidence for it being the case. We could, of course, include all kinds of other examples, but let's go on to the relevance of these distinctions. So theories of personal identity, that's PI, personal identity, that do not distinguish between the two questions are often empiricist theories. So there are theories that don't seem to worry about the difference between those two questions, and Swinburne calls these empiricist theories, and rightly so. So, for example, Derek Parfit, Sidney Shoemaker, these are people who propose empiricist theories. In some respects, we could say this about many other people. David Wiggins would be another person, for example. Now, empiricist theories assume that there's really no distinction between the evidence, when it's fully revealed, and the truth of the matter. And Swinburne just wants to make it clear, as we explore his view, that there can be a difference. There can be a very significant difference between what we can know and what is the case. And that applies to personal identity. So some criticisms of empiricist theories. Swinburne describes two major ways of developing empiricist theories. That's the ET there. One way is to talk about bodily continuity. So this is a common way. This inevitably ends up focusing on the brain, because if you're going to be identical with part of your body, the brain is the most reasonable thing to say that you are identical with. So this is one approach. Or a second option would be memory or psychological continuity. This is the case with John Locke's view and Sidney Shoemaker, who has a contemporary version of John Locke's view, where the focus is on what's going on mentally, not physically. And both approaches face some serious problems. The approach focusing on the body has a problem when duplication is considered. So with the brain, if you're able to duplicate it with a teletransporter machine, something like that, you could make two copies. If you can make one, why can't you make two? But then you end up with two different people, and they cannot obviously be identical to people then later at a later time who are going to be distinct from each other, two people existing at the same time. So that's a problem with duplication. The memory and psychological view also has a problem with duplication, and that's noted when Swinburne criticizes Shoemaker's view. So if you have somebody who has all of the apparent memories of, say, Guy Fawkes, and he even has information that kind of explains things that people didn't know, but it fits in with the life of Guy Fawkes and all this. So the memory theory would end up saying, yes, this is Guy Fawkes, but the problem is, what if somebody else comes along and also has all the same kinds of memories and psychology? That's a serious problem. Okay. Some other problems with empiricist theories. In order to handle these possibilities of duplication, and also with branching, like might occur if you're focusing on the brain and the brain goes into two different directions after a separation of the right and left hemisphere, the empirical theories are going to have to add clauses that say, okay, this is the theory and no branching or duplication occurs. So that's what Shoemaker and Wiggins ends up doing. Wiggins is someone who focuses on the physical brain. Again, Shoemaker focusing on personality and memory. Other people might just give up on personal identity altogether, which seems to be what Derek Parfit does. So if there's any branching in any way or any kind of duplication, then there's no personal identity after that time. There's no diachronic identity that passes over two different times. So this is a problem for empirical theories. Both Shoemaker's theory and Wiggins' theories, the idea that one could survive, here's the problem, one could survive the loss of a brain hemisphere, right? So this has happened where someone's at least a very, very large proportion of one hemisphere is destroyed by an accident of some kind, maybe a gunshot, and the person continues to survive. We have the same brain, we have the same personality, it seems to be the same person, etc. But now, if you can survive that, and suppose you could survive the loss of an entire hemisphere, and so you meet the criteria for survival for most empirical theories, but only if there's no branching or duplication, because now it seems like, well, you would have survived unless there had been branching. So you would survive the operation, say, that separates two hemispheres and puts them into two new bodies. And if you didn't worry about the other body, that you didn't transplant it, then you definitely survive according to the empiricist theories. But if you do transplant it and it's a success and the other person survives, or you survive, it's unclear at this point, then that's just really strange, right? It's irrelevant what happens to the one hemisphere, whether or not you survive. It shouldn't be considered on whether you survive, on what happens to something else, right? So that's the problem. Okay, now criticism specifically of Parfit by Swinburne. So Swinburne addresses the types of theories we see with Shoemaker, with Wiggins, and now he addresses Parfit specifically. So Swinburne argues that Parfit faces this difficulty in the particular situation, this thought experiment. So there's a mad scientist, and he's going to do this kind of duplication. And with one of the two people who is duplicated, he's either going to provide a great reward. Well, he will provide a great reward for one, a lot of money, and the other one he's going to punish horribly and torture. Now, it seems to matter which person is tortured and which person is given this lush life. So Swinburne says, if you consider this thought experiment, you're the one that's going to be duplicated. You get to choose, okay, you know, this person or that person, torture that one or reward that one. It seems like you can make the wrong choice, right? So that's the idea. That's the worst problem for Parfit. The very possibility that a person could make the wrong choice shows that Parfit is wrong. But Parfit's view implies that there cannot possibly be a wrong choice. And it seems like it's possible that you make the wrong choice. Just theoretically possible that you make the wrong choice. Now, we're going to rely on possibility here in just a moment when we get to Swinburne's argument for his view. And what is the view? It's called the simple view, and it's most commonly known as substance dualism. That's Swinburne's view. And Swinburne is a proponent of modal arguments. So modal being the idea related to possibilities, necessity, impossibilities. So modal arguments rely on some kind of possibility. Now, in some possible world, some possibility, I exist, but this body, this particular body does not exist. That seems reasonable, that could happen, certainly on normal modal logic and reasoning through possible worlds. People seem to say, yes, that's a possible world, that you were existing, but you don't have the body you do right now. Now, these possibilities seem to imply dualism. There are other situations that we may have from science fiction or cases that we've heard people talk about, body swapping cases. So there are movies, Freaky Friday, there's an old one, there's a new one, there's vice versa, there's Change Up. Those are just titles of movies that include some kind of body swapping going on. I certainly don't endorse any of those movies in particular, nor am I saying they're horrible, horrible, don't watch them. It's just these are movies that include the idea of body swapping. It seems to make sense that this is possible. And then the idea of resurrection, having a new body, the idea that is common in traditional monotheistic religions, or the idea of reincarnation, like is common in Hindu beliefs. These religious views that are very prominent have this idea within them that seems to only make sense if dualism is true. Or maybe living with no body at all, not having a body. Like descriptions in some out-of-body experiences. Sorry for all the abbreviations, OBEs, out-of-body experiences, where people have reported some kind of astral projection of sorts, or maybe near-death experiences where they say they've left their body. So this happens with operation rooms and somebody's declared dead, but then the CPR is being performed and they say later that they were up in the corner of the room watching the medical staff work on their body, and then they succeed and they feel like getting sucked back into their body. These kinds of experiences are very common, widely reported, and Swinburne says they really only make sense if substance dualism is true. So let's put this into an argument, and we're going to do two versions of the argument. One's pretty straightforward and simple, and then we'll give a little more detail on the next slide. There must be an immaterial soul if those things that we were just talking about are really possible. So the idea is that the person is composed of an immaterial part that is essential to them. They can't live without the immaterial part. And then a material part that we all have in normal living that is not essential to us. So we have two parts, an immaterial part and a material part. And it seems that it's logically possible that a conscious person exists without a body. Some of the rationale for that, given on the previous slide, we talked through those cases. But if one is true, then there must be a part of the person other than the body that can continue to exist. And of course, we would call that the soul. And if that's the case, then a conscious person has a soul. That's the immaterial part that is essential to the person. Now, we can put this in a more careful argument. There is a possible world in which I exist and survive, but without a physical body. That seems to be a coherent, possible world. And if there's a possible world in which I exist and survive without a body, if one is true, then the physical body is not essential to me. And so we can anticipate what 3 is going to say. If the physical body is not essential to me, then I am not identical with my physical body, nor, of course, any part of my physical body, so nor the brain or any other smaller part. And if I'm not identical with any part of my physical body, there must be an immaterial part of me that's essential for my survival. We go through the reasoning process in all 4 of these being put together, and you can conclude that the essential part of me is my immaterial soul, right? The thing that follows, that continues to exist, that's not a physical body nor part of a physical body. So Swinburne says this argument is good enough to conclude that we have an immaterial soul, and that is the essential part of us that can exist without a body. Now, there are some problems to address here. The classic problem raised against substance dualism is the interaction problem. How does this soul, or you might say me, get associated with this particular body? How does an immaterial soul get associated with a particular body? How does interaction take place? And then there's more concerns about how can an immaterial thing have causal interactions with something that is physical. So take something that most people would agree is an immaterial thing. If they think it's something at all, say the number 7. The number 7 doesn't actually physically interact with the world, the number itself. And so how could something that's immaterial interact with something that's physical? Now, certainly you can't resolve the problem by saying there's a spatial location that they share, because the soul's immaterial, and being immaterial, it shouldn't have any location whatsoever. Now, Swinburne says, look, here's how you address the problem. It's merely a matter of having causal powers that's related to this body. So using a particular body, say for input about the world, it's having causal powers of the physical body inform the soul, and then the soul, of course, being able to control and direct this body immediately, right? There's this immediate connection. So that's his definition. That may not be satisfactory for some, but that's how he says it happens. The connection is merely a matter of having causal powers related to the physical body, not being located in the same place or having other kinds of concerns that fit together. It's this, there is a possibility of having these causal powers. So that makes sense according to Swinburne. Now, what advantages might there be with substance dualism? For one, Swinburne thinks that his view meets all the criteria that we have for personal identity, such as the significance of our memories from the inside, having this internal perspective on our mental life, even though we could lose them and continue to survive. If we have an immaterial soul, that seems to make sense. The soul continues to exist, that has the memories from the inside, but it could continue to exist without them. And so that's how you could have survival in contrast to, say, Shoemaker's view and Locke's view. We do certainly have a great concern for the continuity of existence, but though that may not always be through physical means. The thought experiment with the duplication reveals this. And if you have a soul that goes with one, but not with the other, of course, then you are invested in what happens in the future with that duplication concern. And then finally, personal identity should allow for personal, and again, another acronym, moral responsibility is the MR, moral responsibility. And that seems to be able to occur post-mortem, right, after death. And that's important for Hinduism, for monotheistic traditions, those kinds of things. So it fits with other beliefs that a lot of people have, and it solves problems that empiricist theories cannot solve.